The billionaire's fiancé ordered the maid's daughter hidden from the party, but before this night was over, that same little girl would become the one person nobody in the room could stop talking about. Emily Brooks had been awake since 4:30 that morning. By 6 o'clock in the evening, her feet hurt so badly she could feel every step through the thin soles of her shoes. Still, she kept moving. She always did. For 6 years, Emily had worked inside the Carter estate, a sprawling mansion overlooking the city, owned by billionaire William Carter. The property was famous for its marble halls, towering windows, and lavish charity events attended by some of the most influential people in the state. Tonight was the biggest event of the year, the Carter Foundation Gala. More than 200 guests were expected. Governors, business leaders, celebrities, and major donors would soon fill the grand ballroom. Every crystal glass sparkled. Every flower arrangement was perfectly placed. Every detail had been inspected repeatedly by the woman overseeing the event, William Carter's fiancée, Victoria Hayes. Emily had spent the entire week helping prepare for the gala while also caring for her 5-year-old daughter, Sophie. Her regular babysitter had canceled that morning, and with no family nearby and no one else to call, she had no choice but to bring Sophie with her. The little girl had spent most of the day quietly drawing pictures in the staff lounge. Sophie never complained. She seemed happy just watching the world around her. As the afternoon turned into evening, music from the ballroom drifted through the mansion corridors. Sophie followed the sound like a bird following sunlight. She stopped near one of the ballroom doors and watched musicians rehearse. Her eyes widened with wonder. She stood perfectly still, completely captivated by every note. That was the exact moment Victoria Hayes turned the corner and saw her. Victoria stopped walking. Her smile disappeared. She looked from Sophie to Emily, who was adjusting table settings nearby. "Emily," Victoria said sharply. Emily immediately knew something was wrong. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria pointed toward Sophie. "Is that your daughter?" Emily nodded. "Yes, ma'am. My sitter canceled unexpectedly. She's only watching for a minute." Victoria's expression hardened. This is not a place for staff children. Tonight's guests expect elegance and professionalism. I don't want people asking questions. Emily felt heat rise into her face. "I'm sorry. I'll move her right away." Victoria folded her arms. "Take her downstairs. Keep her in the service area, completely out of sight. The last thing I need is a maid's daughter wandering through the gala." The words landed like stones. Emily lowered her eyes and quietly nodded. "Of course." Victoria turned and walked away without another word. Sophie had heard everything. Emily crossed the room and took her daughter's hand. Together they walked toward the lower level. Neither spoke until they reached a quiet hallway near the staff rooms. Then Sophie finally looked up at her mother. Her small voice was soft and innocent. "Mommy." Emily forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie hesitated. "Did I do something wrong?" For a moment, Emily could not answer. She knelt beside her daughter and gently held both of her hands. "No, baby," she whispered. "You did nothing wrong at all." But as Sophie stared back at her, Emily realized something painful. Sometimes the world makes good people feel small simply because of where they stand. True worth is not determined by status, wealth, or the opinions of others. The people most often overlooked may be carrying gifts the world has not discovered yet. And as Sophie listened to the distant music echoing through the walls below the grand ballroom, neither she nor her mother had any idea that the secret she was carrying would soon change everything. Sophie had no idea that the secret she was carrying would soon change everything. But down in the quiet service corridor, something far more important than the gala was unfolding. Emily settled her daughter into a small staff break room tucked away beneath the grand staircase. The room was plain and windowless, filled with storage cabinets, folding chairs, and the distant hum of air conditioning. It could not have felt more different from the sparkling ballroom above. Yet Sophie did not complain. She climbed onto a chair, folded her small hands in her lap, and listened. Through the ceiling came the faint sound of music. Most people would have barely noticed it. Sophie heard every note. Emily knelt beside her. "I need to finish helping upstairs, sweetheart. Will you stay here for me?" Sophie nodded. "Yes, Mommy." Emily kissed the top of her head and returned to work. For the next hour, guests arrived in luxury cars while photographers captured smiling faces outside the mansion. Inside, servers moved quickly between tables and event staff rushed through final preparations. Meanwhile, Sophie sat alone with a sheet of paper and a box of crayons. But she was not drawing flowers or animals. She was drawing musical notes. She had been doing it for months. What Emily did not know was that Sophie possessed an unusual gift. She could remember melodies after hearing them only once. Nearly a year earlier, a music teacher at Sophie's preschool had noticed it by accident. The class had been learning a simple piano exercise. The teacher played the tune one time and asked the children to sing it back. Most of the children remembered only fragments. Sophie sang every note perfectly. Curious, the teacher tried again with a more difficult melody. Sophie repeated that one too. By the end of the week, the teacher had privately told Emily something she would never forget. Your daughter hears music differently. I cannot explain it, but there is something very special about her. The teacher had even allowed Sophie to stay after class several times and practice on an old beginner violin that the school kept in storage. Although she had never received formal lessons, Sophie quickly learned how to hold the instrument, find simple notes, and imitate short melodies by ear. She was far from a trained musician, but her unusual ability to remember music made every practice session seem almost effortless. Sometimes the teacher joked that Sophie learned more in 15 minutes than some students learned in weeks. Emily had smiled politely, but never acted on the recommendation to pursue further lessons. Private instruction was expensive. Rent came first. Groceries came first. Electricity came first. Dreams had to wait. Yet Sophie never stopped listening. Every song she heard became part of her world. She tapped rhythms on tabletops. She hummed melodies while brushing her teeth. She turned ordinary sounds into music. Back in the staff room, she pressed her ear gently against the wall and listened to the orchestra rehearsing upstairs. Her tiny fingers began moving through the air as if she were conducting an invisible performance. At that same moment, William Carter was greeting donors near the ballroom entrance. He was respected throughout the city for his success and generosity, but tonight his attention was focused entirely on fundraising goals and guest lists. He had no idea a little girl sat beneath the ballroom, listening to music through the walls. As the evening continued, an announcement echoed through the mansion. The featured youth performance would begin later that night. It was expected to be the highlight of the gala. Sophie smiled when she heard the announcement. She already knew the music they would play. She had quietly listened to the rehearsals for days while waiting for her mother after work. Unknown to everyone around her, she had memorized every note. Above her, the grand ballroom sparkled with wealth and prestige. Below it, a child with no invitation carried a gift that no amount of money could buy. And before the night was over, a sudden crisis would place that hidden gift directly in front of everyone. But first, something unexpected was about to happen to the performance that the entire gala was depending on. The entire gala was depending on one performance, and within the next few minutes, everything began falling apart. At 7:30 in the evening, the ballroom was nearly full. Crystal glasses reflected golden light across the room, while soft conversations blended with the sound of the orchestra preparing backstage. More than 200 distinguished guests had taken their seats. The featured performance by the Young Stars Music Academy was scheduled to begin in less than 30 minutes. It was the centerpiece of the evening and one of the main reasons so many donors had attended. Backstage, however, panic was spreading. Ava Reynolds, the 13-year-old violin prodigy selected to perform the solo piece, sat in a chair with her face pale and her hands trembling. She had spent months preparing for this night. Reporters had written articles about her talent. Sponsors had traveled across the state to hear her perform. But now she could barely sit upright. The Academy director, Margaret Foster, knelt beside her and gently touched her forehead. The result immediately made her heart sink. Ava had a fever, a severe one. Within minutes, it became obvious that she could not perform. Margaret quickly gathered her staff. Quiet voices filled the backstage area as everyone searched desperately for a solution. There was no understudy. The solo had been customized specifically for Ava's abilities. The orchestra knew only this arrangement. Canceling the performance would disappoint every guest in attendance and create a public embarrassment for the Academy. News of the problem reached Victoria Hayes almost immediately. Her expression darkened as she listened. "What do you mean she cannot perform?" she asked. "The entire schedule revolves around this performance." Margaret remained calm despite the pressure. "I understand, but the child's health comes first. Victoria glanced toward the ballroom where guests continued enjoying cocktails and conversation. Find a solution, she said firmly. There has to be one. Across the room, William Carter noticed the tension. He approached and quietly asked what was happening. After hearing the situation, he frowned. He understood how much work had gone into the event. Still, he surprised everyone with his response. If the girl is sick, she should rest, he said. Do not pressure her. Margaret nodded gratefully. Yet the problem remained. The performance was only minutes away. Meanwhile, down in the service corridor, Sophie continued listening to the distant sounds filtering through the ceiling. She could tell something was different. The rehearsals had stopped. The usual flow of music had been replaced by hurried footsteps and anxious voices. Curious, she moved closer to a partially open service door. From there, she could hear snippets of conversation drifting down the hallway. No soloist. The performance may be canceled. The guests are already seated. Sophie did not fully understand the situation, but one thing caught her attention. The music she loved might not be played tonight. Her small face fell. For weeks, she had secretly listened to that beautiful piece whenever she waited for her mother after work. She knew every rise and fall of the melody. She knew every emotional turn. In her mind, she could already hear the entire composition. Upstairs, the pressure continued mounting. The orchestra conductor checked his watch repeatedly. Margaret searched desperately for alternatives. Victoria grew increasingly frustrated. And hidden beneath all the luxury, all the wealth, and all the carefully planned perfection, a little girl quietly stood holding the answer nobody had even considered. But when Sophie finally stepped closer to the backstage area, what she overheard next would change the course of the entire evening. Sophie had no idea that the conversation she was about to overhear would place her directly in the path of a moment nobody in the mansion could control. Standing quietly near the partially open backstage door, she listened as worried adults spoke in hurried voices. There is no replacement. The guests are already waiting. We cannot delay much longer. Sophie did not understand every word, but she understood enough. The music she loved was in trouble. She slowly stepped closer and peeked through the opening. Beyond the door was a world completely different from the service corridors below. Bright stage lights glowed above polished wood floors. Musicians adjusted sheet music. Staff members moved quickly from place to place. Everyone looked worried. Hidden behind a stack of equipment cases, Sophie watched without making a sound. Back in the ballroom, the guests had begun checking their watches. Conversations grew louder. The delay was becoming noticeable. Victoria Hayes forced polite smiles while moving from table to table, reassuring important donors that the performance would begin shortly. Inside, however, frustration was building. Every minute that passed threatened the flawless evening she had spent months planning. William Carter remained calm, but even he could see the growing concern among the organizers. Meanwhile, backstage, Margaret Foster continued searching for a solution that did not exist. Then something unexpected happened. One of the orchestra assistants accidentally left a small student violin resting on a chair near the wings. It belonged to a younger performer from an earlier rehearsal. Sophie noticed it immediately. Her eyes locked onto the instrument. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she looked toward the stage where the empty spotlight waited. The melody she had memorized played softly inside her mind. Every note felt alive. Every phrase felt familiar. It was the same piece she had listened to over and over while waiting for her mother after work. The same piece she had quietly followed from beginning to end dozens of times. Sophie took one cautious step forward, then another. She reached the edge of the curtain and stopped. The audience was visible now. Hundreds of elegantly dressed guests filled the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. The stage seemed enormous. For a moment, Sophie felt very small. Then she remembered something her mother always told her whenever life felt scary. Just take one step, sweetheart. Then take the next one. Sophie smiled softly. Behind her, nobody was paying attention. The staff remained focused on the crisis. The musicians remained focused on the missing soloist. The organizers remained focused on saving the event. Nobody noticed the little girl standing near the wings. Nobody except one elderly violinist seated near the orchestra pit. He spotted Sophie holding onto the curtain. Instead of stopping her, he simply watched with curious eyes. Something about her expression made him pause. It was not fear. It was not confusion. It was recognition. The look of someone hearing a song they already knew by heart. Above the stage entrance, the house lights dimmed slightly. The audience quieted. The orchestra conductor raised his baton. A ripple of anticipation moved through the ballroom. Sophie looked toward the abandoned violin resting nearby. Then she looked back at the stage. And in that single moment, a 5-year-old girl made a decision that would leave an entire room speechless. The first note had not even been played yet, but the most unforgettable performance of the night was already beginning. The most unforgettable performance of the night was already beginning, and nobody in that ballroom was prepared for what they were about to witness. As the house lights dimmed, a quiet expectation settled over the room. Guests straightened in their chairs. Conversations faded. Every eye turned toward the stage, expecting the scheduled performance to begin. Instead, a small figure stepped out from behind the curtain. Sophie walked slowly into the spotlight, holding the student violin with both hands. For a brief moment, nobody reacted. The audience simply stared. The image made no sense. A 5-year-old girl stood alone on a stage designed for professional performers. She wore a simple dress. She was not listed in the program. She was not part of the academy. She was certainly not the celebrated soloist everyone had come to hear. Confused murmurs spread across the ballroom. Several guests exchanged puzzled looks. One man near the front smiled politely, assuming it was some kind of introduction. Others looked toward the organizers for an explanation. Victoria Hayes froze. The color drained from her face almost instantly. "What is she doing up there?" she whispered. Her voice carried more panic than anger. She immediately turned toward a nearby event coordinator. "Get her off the stage." But before anyone could move, something unexpected happened. Sophie lifted the violin. Her hands looked tiny against the instrument. The room grew even quieter. The orchestra conductor lowered his baton and watched. Margaret Foster stopped mid-step backstage. William Carter leaned forward in his seat. Even the musicians seemed uncertain whether they should intervene. Then Sophie played the first note. It floated through the ballroom like a single beam of light breaking through clouds. The sound was pure, clear, beautiful. Every whisper in the room vanished instantly. Sophie continued. One note became a phrase. One phrase became a melody. The melody became the very piece everyone had expected to hear that night. The same composition the missing soloist had spent months preparing. Guests who had been confused moments earlier now stared in disbelief. This was not random playing. This was not a child making noise. Sophie knew the music. Somehow, impossibly, she knew every part of it. William's eyes widened. Margaret Foster took a slow step forward, unable to believe what she was hearing. The elderly violinist who had spotted Sophie earlier smiled softly to himself. He had sensed something unusual, but even he had not expected this. Sophie continued alone for nearly 30 seconds. The room remained silent as everyone tried to understand what they were witnessing. The conductor watched carefully, expecting hesitation or mistakes. Instead, he noticed something extraordinary. The little girl was not guessing. She knew the structure of the piece. She anticipated each transition naturally. She understood where every phrase was leading. When she reached one of the more difficult passages cleanly and confidently, the conductor slowly lowered his shoulders. A smile appeared on his face. For the first time that evening, hope replaced panic. Only then did he raise his baton and invite the orchestra to join her. One by one, the musicians entered the performance. Suddenly, Sophie was no longer standing alone. The full orchestra surrounded her with music. Yet she never looked frightened. She never looked overwhelmed. She simply played. Not perfectly, not with the polished precision of a trained prodigy, but with something far more powerful. Heart. Every note carried genuine feeling. Every phrase sounded honest. The audience could sense it. They were not watching technical excellence. They were witnessing something real. In the center of the room, William Carter found himself unable to look away. For the first time all evening, he forgot about donors, schedules, and fundraising goals. He simply listened. Around him, hundreds of guests did the same. And as Sophie's melody continued filling the ballroom, nobody realized that the most astonishing part of her performance had not even happened yet. Because within the next few minutes, the little girl everyone had overlooked was about to reveal a gift that would leave the entire room speechless. Not everyone in the ballroom was about to walk away from that moment feeling inspired, but for a few unforgettable seconds after the final note faded, nobody moved at all. The silence was so complete that Sophie could hear her own breathing. Standing alone beneath the spotlight, she lowered the violin and looked out across the sea of faces. She did not understand what had just happened. She was only 5 years old. In her mind, she had simply played a song she loved. Then the first person stood. An elderly man near the front rose slowly to his feet and began clapping. A second later, his wife joined him. Then another table stood. Then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. More than 200 guests rose from their chairs in a standing ovation unlike anything the Carter Foundation Gala had ever seen. The sound filled every corner of the mansion. Sophie blinked in surprise. Her eyes widened. She looked toward the crowd as though she could not understand why everyone was making so much noise. Then she smiled. It was a small, innocent smile that somehow made the applause grow even louder. Several guests were openly wiping away tears. One prominent business executive, who rarely showed emotion, sat shaking his head in disbelief. A state senator pressed a hand against his chest as if trying to steady himself. The performance had touched something deeper than entertainment. It reminded people of simpler things, of dreams, of family, of love given without expecting anything in return. Backstage, Margaret Foster felt her eyes becoming wet. During her career, she had watched hundreds of talented children perform, but she had never seen a room respond quite like this. Talent could impress people. Technical perfection could earn admiration, but authenticity could move hearts. Sophie had done something far rarer than playing music well. She had made people feel. Across the ballroom, William Carter remained standing. His gaze shifted from Sophie to Emily. He watched as the young mother stood frozen near the service entrance with tears streaming down her cheeks. In that moment, he noticed details he had overlooked for years. The exhaustion behind her eyes. The worn shoes she probably replaced less often than she should. The quiet dignity she carried despite constantly putting everyone else's needs ahead of her own. William suddenly felt uncomfortable. Not because of anything Sophie had done, but because of what he realized about himself. Emily had worked in his home for 6 years. 6 years. Yet he knew almost nothing about her life. He knew what tasks she performed. He knew her employee records. He knew her schedule. But he had never truly seen her as a person with struggles, hopes, sacrifices, and dreams. The realization hit harder than he expected. While the applause continued, Sophie searched the room until she found her mother. The instant their eyes met, her face brightened completely. Without thinking, she lifted the violin slightly as if showing Emily what she had done. The gesture was so simple and so sincere that several guests began crying again. Everything about the moment felt genuine. There was no performance left. No spotlight. No social status. No distinction between wealthy guests and household staff. There was only a little girl sharing her happiness with her mother. Yet while most of the room was being transformed by what they had witnessed, one person stood perfectly still, watching the scene with a very different emotion. And what happened next would force her to confront a truth she had spent years avoiding. One person stood perfectly still, watching the scene with a very different emotion, and within minutes the entire ballroom would witness a moment she could not escape. Victoria Hayes remained near the front of the room as the standing ovation continued around her. Everywhere she looked, guests were smiling, applauding, and talking about Sophie. The little girl she had ordered hidden only hours earlier had become the center of the gala. Victoria tried to maintain her composure, but the confidence she had carried all evening was beginning to crack. Then something happened that made it impossible to pretend otherwise. A well-known philanthropist named Harold Whitmore approached her with a warm smile. He was one of the foundation's largest donors and had attended every Carter Gala for nearly a decade. He glanced toward Sophie, who was now standing beside Margaret Foster while guests continued applauding. "Remarkable child," Harold said. "Absolutely remarkable." Victoria forced a polite smile. "Yes, she surprised everyone." Harold nodded. "I heard she is the daughter of one of the household employees." Victoria felt her stomach tighten. "That is correct." Harold looked genuinely puzzled. Then why was she hidden downstairs all evening? The question landed harder than she expected. 2 nearby guests immediately turned toward them. Victoria searched for an answer, but found none that sounded reasonable anymore. Not after what everyone had just witnessed. Not after the entire ballroom had fallen in love with Sophie. Before she could respond, another guest joined the conversation. I heard she was not even supposed to be here. A third guest added quietly. Imagine if someone had succeeded in keeping her out of sight. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody said anything cruel. Nobody raised their voice. Yet Victoria suddenly felt exposed in a way she had never experienced before. For years she had believed she understood how successful events should be managed. She believed appearances mattered. She believed image mattered. Tonight, a 5-year-old girl had dismantled that belief in front of 200 witnesses. Across the room, William noticed the interaction. He watched Victoria struggle to answer simple questions. More importantly, he noticed something else. The people speaking were not criticizing Sophie. They were questioning the mindset that had treated her as a problem in the first place. The realization stayed with him. As the evening continued, guests gathered around Sophie and Emily. Some congratulated the little girl. Others spoke kindly with Emily. Several donors offered to support music education programs. The atmosphere of the gala had completely changed. It felt warmer, more genuine, more human. For the first time all night, Emily was no longer invisible. William found himself observing everything from a distance. He listened to guests praise Sophie. He watched Emily thank people with quiet humility. And he could not stop thinking about the contrast between what had happened and what almost happened. A child had nearly been hidden away because she did not fit someone's idea of what belonged at a prestigious event. Yet that same child had become the most meaningful part of the entire evening. The lesson felt impossible to ignore. Later, as guests returned to their tables and the orchestra prepared for the next segment of the program, William made a decision. He turned to his assistant and spoke quietly. "When the gala is over, I would like to speak with Emily privately." His assistant nodded. Across the room, Victoria overheard those words. And for the first time that night, she realized the consequences of what had happened might extend far beyond a single performance. What William was about to learn about Emily and Sophie would change much more than the ending of the gala. What William was about to learn about Emily and Sophie would change much more than the ending of the gala. Nearly an hour later, the final guests were beginning to leave the ballroom. The orchestra had finished its last piece. The fundraising auction had exceeded every expectation, and conversations throughout the mansion were still centered on one subject: Sophie's performance. The little girl herself had fallen asleep in a chair backstage, curled beneath Emily's light sweater, completely unaware that she had become the most talked-about person in the building. Emily sat nearby, watching her daughter sleep. The exhaustion of the day had finally caught up with her. She was still wearing her work uniform. She still had responsibilities waiting for her. Yet everything felt strangely different. The evening that had begun with humiliation had somehow transformed into something she could not fully understand. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up and saw William Carter standing in the doorway. He had come alone. No assistant. No staff members. No reporters. Just William. "May I come in?" he asked. Emily immediately stood. "Of course, sir." William glanced towards Sophie, sleeping peacefully in the chair, before pulling over another chair for himself. For a few moments, neither spoke. Finally, William broke the silence. "How long has she been interested in music?" Emily smiled softly. "As long as I can remember." She told him about the preschool teacher who had noticed Sophie's unusual ability to remember melodies. She explained how Sophie listened to music constantly, how she could identify songs after hearing only a few notes, and how she spent hours pretending to conduct invisible orchestras in their small apartment. William listened carefully. "Has she ever had formal lessons?" Emily shook her head. "I wanted to enroll her. I just could not afford it." The answer stayed with him. William looked down at the floor for several seconds before speaking again. "Emily, I owe you an apology." Emily blinked in surprise. "Sir." William took a slow breath. "You have worked in my home for 6 years. During that time, I convinced myself I was a fair employer because I paid salaries on time and treated people politely. Tonight, I realized something uncomfortable. I never took the time to understand the people working around me." Emily remained silent. William continued. "I knew your name. I knew your schedule. But I never knew your story. I never knew you were carrying so much responsibility alone." His voice was sincere. "I should have known." Emily felt emotion rising unexpectedly in her chest. Nobody had ever apologized to her for not seeing her struggles before. Most people simply expected her to endure them quietly. William leaned forward slightly. "I would like to change that." He explained that Margaret Foster had already spoken with him. The academy director believed Sophie's talent was extraordinary and wanted to offer her a full scholarship to the academy's youth music program. Every lesson would be covered. Every instrument would be provided. Earlier that evening, Margaret had gathered several academy instructors to review what they had witnessed. Their conclusion had been unanimous. One instructor described Sophie as the most naturally gifted child he had encountered in 15 years. Another said she possessed a level of musical intuition that simply could not be taught. Margaret had looked directly at William and said, "If this child receives the right guidance, she could accomplish extraordinary things." Emily stared at him in disbelief. Before she could respond, William continued. He explained that he had already asked his leadership team to begin reviewing several changes within the Carter organization. Emily would receive a significant salary increase and more flexible hours. He also intended to establish a family support program for employees raising children alone so that others would not face the same struggles in silence. The room fell quiet. Emily looked toward her sleeping daughter and felt tears filling her eyes once again. For the first time in years, the future seemed larger than survival. It seemed full of possibility. Yet neither of them realized that someone else had overheard the entire conversation from the hallway outside. And what Victoria heard that night would force her to confront a reality she could no longer ignore. What Victoria heard that night would force her to confront a reality she could no longer ignore. And within a few short weeks, every life touched by that gala would begin moving in a different direction. After William left the room, Victoria remained alone in the hallway for several minutes. The conversation she had overheard replayed in her mind again and again. She had expected William to praise the little girl. She had expected him to thank Emily for her years of service. What she had not expected was to hear genuine regret in his voice. For the first time, Victoria found herself asking a question she had avoided for years. When had she become someone who measured people's worth by where they stood instead of who they were? The answer did not come easily. The following days were unusually quiet. News of Sophie's performance spread throughout the city. Videos recorded by guests appeared online. One particular video quickly attracted extraordinary attention. Within days, millions of people had watched it. Viewers were not discussing luxury decorations, wealthy donors, or celebrity guests. They were talking about the little girl who had stepped onto a stage after being told she did not belong there. Thousands praised her courage. Thousands more praised the quiet dignity of her mother. For the first time in her life, Emily felt that people were seeing her family for who they truly were. Local newspapers published stories about Sophie. Television stations requested interviews. Music educators from across the state reached out to Margaret Foster. Yet the most important changes happened far away from cameras and headlines. Sophie's scholarship officially began. For the first time in her life, she entered a real music studio filled with instruments, teachers, and students who shared her love for music. Margaret Foster personally welcomed her on the first day. The instructors quickly realized the stories had not been exaggerated. Emily's life changed as well. The salary increase allowed her to move into a safer apartment. The flexible schedule gave her something she had not enjoyed in years. Time. Time to help Sophie practice. Time to eat dinner together. Time to simply be a mother instead of constantly worrying about survival. William followed through on every promise he had made. The family support program expanded throughout his organization. Employees who had quietly struggled for years suddenly found themselves receiving resources and assistance they never expected. A week after the gala, William attended a foundation board meeting. Several members praised the fundraising success, but one comment stayed with him long after the meeting ended. An elderly board member smiled and said, "The most valuable thing that happened that night was not the money we raised. It was the reminder that human potential can appear anywhere." William immediately thought of Sophie. He realized that the little girl had done more than save a performance. She had changed the way people looked at one another. Yet one final change remained. 3 weeks after the gala, William and Victoria sat together in a private garden overlooking the city. The conversation was calm, respectful, honest. There was no argument, no anger, no blame. Victoria admitted that the gala had revealed something difficult. She and William valued different things. When she looked back on that evening, she remembered embarrassment. William remembered inspiration. When she saw Sophie walk onto the stage, she worried about appearances. William saw possibility. Neither of them was a villain. Neither of them was cruel, but they were no longer walking toward the same future. By the end of the conversation, they quietly agreed to end their engagement. It was not a dramatic ending. It was simply the truth. And sometimes the truth is the kindest ending of all. A month later, on a bright autumn morning, Emily stood outside the music academy watching Sophie enter the building for another lesson. Halfway through the doorway, Sophie stopped and turned around. She spotted her mother waiting outside and smiled. It was the same smile she had given her on stage that night. Pure, proud, full of love. Then she ran back, wrapped her arms around Emily, and whispered, "Mommy, I am learning all this because of you." Emily felt tears fill her eyes once more. Not tears of exhaustion this time. Not tears of worry. Tears of gratitude. Across the street, William happened to be arriving for a meeting with Academy sponsors. He witnessed the moment from a distance and smiled quietly to himself. A little girl who had once been told to stay out of sight was now walking confidently toward her future. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. The people we overlook are often carrying extraordinary gifts. Kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything. And sometimes the person the world tries to hide becomes the very person who teaches everyone else how to truly see. This story reminds us that true value is never determined by wealth, status, or appearance. Every person we meet may be carrying hidden talents, silent struggles, and beautiful dreams. When we choose kindness over judgment and compassion over assumptions, we create opportunities for others to shine. The educational purpose of this story is to encourage empathy, humility, respect, and the belief that every individual deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. As the author of this story, I believe one of the greatest mistakes we make in life is assuming we know someone's worth before knowing their story. Watching Sophie transform an entire room reminded me that talent often grows quietly where nobody is looking. Emily's perseverance showed me that love and sacrifice rarely receive the recognition they deserve. William's transformation proved that real strength comes from being willing to admit when we have been wrong. Victoria's journey reminded me that self-reflection can be uncomfortable, but it is often the first step toward growth. This story reinforced my belief that kindness is never wasted. It reminded me that children often teach adults the lessons they have forgotten. It showed me that opportunities can change lives when they are given to the right people. It reminded me to pay attention to those who are often overlooked. Most importantly, it taught me that one small act of courage can inspire change far beyond what we imagine. This story contains some creative elements and the use of AI technology, with the purpose of providing enjoyable entertainment while sharing valuable, inspiring life lessons for viewers and listeners. Disclaimer: the situations, characters, and events presented in this story may include dramatized or fictionalized elements created for educational, inspirational, and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental. The primary goal of this content is to encourage positive values, empathy, personal growth, and meaningful reflection.